But let's move on to the second item, and that is an item about order, and more specifically, order of execution. Why is that even a topic? Well, it's a topic because of this. This is a profile. It doesn't really matter which profile it is, but this is a profile, and on the left-hand side, you see all of the different categories of stuff that is used in that profile. Well, in there you have things that check, and those nice orange arrows point out where you find these checks. They are in different locations throughout the profile. And then also you have things that fix or that fix when necessary. Remember that a fix-up is not always going to change the document. It's always executed as part of your profile, but it might very well conclude that nothing needs to be done. So it's not always executed, but there are still fixes in this profile. And now there are a number of questions. If you look at this slide, this shows which checks are in the custom checks section of the profile. And you see a very long list in the middle of all the checks that are in this profile. And one could wonder, well, which of these checks is executed first? Same for fix-ups. What's the order in which these fix-ups are executed? And then the overarching question is, when you look at the profile as a whole, what is executed first, checks or fixes? And is that important in any way? Well, it turns out it is. And it is a very common question during trainings and so on, and actually a topic that I certainly spend some time on when I give training. So let me try to explain to you why that is important. And I'm going to take a profile. It doesn't really matter which one I have again, but in this case, it's a profile from the Ghent work group for magazine ads. As you can see, this particular one is based on pdfX4, and that's why you have in the standards compliance section, you have a check for pdfX4. In convert to standard, you have a fix to convert the document to pdfX4. I will unlock it so that you can see that better. So this will convert the PDF document to pdfX4. And then I have a list of checks and fixes, as you just saw on those screen grabs as well. Let's start with the checks. I have this list of checks, and I will make my list in the profile a little bit bigger. So now the question is, in which order are these executed? And it would be very, very natural to assume that that would be in the order that you see here in this window. But that's not the case. However, the more important question is conceptually, is it important in which order you execute checks on a document? And when you start thinking about that, a check does not modify the PDF document in any way. So when I run check number 1, I have a certain state of affairs in the PDF document. When I run check number 2, that state of affairs in my PDF document has not changed because my check, the first check, did not modify my document. And so when you think about it in that way, it is logical that the order in which checks are executed is not really important. You will always get the same result. If you look at a ball and you ask the question, is it red? And then you ask a second question, is it round? The answer will be, or could be, yes in both cases. If I ask the questions in the opposite order, then the answer is still going to be the same. That does not change depending on the order of the questions that I ask, and that's exactly the same that happens, exactly the same principle here. The order in which you run checks is not important. So what's the order that you see here? Well, as you notice perhaps, each of these checks has a little icon at the front of it. And if you look at this list, you'll notice that checks are ordered first of all, by that little icon. So they are grouped depending on which type of check we're looking at. And that means that, for example, everything that has to do with color is grouped together. And if you look at all the checks of one particular group, all of these, for example, then you'll see that within such a group, they are ordered alphabetically, starting with A, ending with W in this particular case. Yeah. So pdfToolbox has the convention that checks in a profile are in the list grouped by topic and then ordered alphabetically, but that does not mean that they are executed in that particular order. And even more importantly, the order in which they are executed doesn't matter. And that's a very important point. Now, I've already given the answer if you think about what I said for checks, but here I have the same thing. I have a list of fixes. Fixes are not grouped by topic the way checks are. And so when I look at this list, you can easily spot that these two are ordered alphabetically. And now the question, of course, becomes, is the order important? And are they executed in the same alphabetical order they are in this list in the profile? Think about what a fix does now. For a check, we said, order isn't important because a check doesn't modify the PDF. A fix, of course, has a definite possibility of modifying the PDF that you're running it on. So if I run fix number A, and then I run fix number B, fix number A will modify the document, or at least can modify the document. So fix number B now sees a modified input document, and the result could be influenced by that. Let me give you an example. In pdfToolbox, I can make a fix that converts all spot color to CMYK. So if I have a document that has a bunch of Pantone colors in it, I can run this fix and all of the Pantone colors will be converted to CMYK. In pdfToolbox, I can also make a fix that would remove all objects using a Pantone color. It's a very simple fix. It's called remove objects, and then you can specify which objects need to be removed using a preflight check. So I can make a fix that removes everything that uses a Pantone color from the document. Now, think about what will happen if I run these two scenarios. If I say convert everything to CMYK first, then I have no Pantone colors in my document. So the fix to remove Pantone colors doesn't remove anything. If I remove Pantone colors first, and then I convert all Pantone to CMYK, the result is going to be completely different. Order for fixes is definitely important in some scenarios. And if you look at the standard profiles that you put together, profiles, PDFX profiles or profiles from the Gantour group and all of these standard profiles that get included within pdfToolbox, then typically the order in which pdfToolbox runs these fixes makes sense. There is an internal logic that pdfToolbox applies to make sure that fixes are executed in a way that is logical. But it is very, very easy to find examples of profiles where order of fix-ups is really important and where it's hard to predict what is going to happen. So what do I do with this? How can I make sure that this list of fixes that I have in pdfToolbox, that these fixes are executed in the order that I want them to be executed? The answer is you can't. There is no way to tell pdfToolbox what the order is that fixes should be run in. And that should be obvious from the user interface. Normally, if the order could be set, what I would expect is here at the bottom, I would expect little arrows to move fixes up and down. That would be a very logical way of doing things. Those little arrows are not there. Hence, Again, you cannot set the order of fixes in a profile. If at some point you need that, if you have different actions that you run on a profile and you want to make sure that they are run in a particular order, then do not use a profile, but instead use a process plan. That is one of the reasons process plans were invented, and I will show you a little bit how that looks in case you haven't used process plans a little bit later. Yeah. So we solved our problem here. Order is not important. We know why they end up in a particular order in the list. We solved our problem here. Well, maybe not quite. We figured out that order is important for fixes and that you cannot control what the order is that pdfToolbox will use. We also know why they appear in that particular order in the list, but it doesn't really help us because we can't know from this how pdfToolbox will handle them. What about the last question that I asked? What is executed first, checks or fix-ups? And to consider that, you have to, again, think about what you are going to do with PDF documents. You have PDF documents coming in. Those PDF documents might be, well, not very good. They might be incorrect in some regards. And you want to verify that they are correct once they leave pdfToolbox. And in some cases, you want to fix them. Let's have a look at this profile that we have here, and I will search for overprint. Well, I have a check here on black text smaller than 12 point, not set to overprint. So this is basically black text set to knockout. I want to get a preflight error because of this, because this could cause problems in production, specifically, for example, registration problems. I've also said in this profile, and we can do the same thing here, I've also said in this profile that this is a problem that I would like to have fixed if it occurs. So I not only have a check, I also have a fix. Now, when I ask this question in trainings, people usually tell me, first of all, the checks will be executed, and then the fixes know where they have to fix things. And that's a very logical thing to think of. Unfortunately, it's also the wrong way to look at this. The way you should look at this is different. You have this document coming in that is bad. Now, the first thing that pdfToolbox needs to do is try and fix it. So all of these fixes that you have here, including our set black text to overprint, will run first. That's the first thing that will happen. Now, when that fix runs, it will run through the document. If there is nothing to fix, it doesn't do anything. If there is something to fix, it will apply its fix, and then you have a modified document. So once all of these fixes have been executed, I have a modified version of my document, for which, of course, I hope that all of the problems have been fixed. And then on that modified version of the document, pdfToolbox will run its checks. And it runs its checks to make sure that all of those things that we have fixed have been fixed in a satisfactory way, and that there is nothing else in the document that still needs to be flagged as a preflight error. Yeah, so the order is very logical if you look at it in the correct way. First of all, the document is going to be fixed, or we're going to attempt to fix it, and then secondly, we're going to check that all of those things that were fixed are now indeed compliant to our profile. This is why in profiles, in the default profiles that you see, for example, those from the Ghent workgroup, you will always have a fix that comes with checks. Yeah. If there is a fix, if there is something that needs to be fixed, normally you should also create a check to make sure that that happens. Let me give you an example of why this is necessary, because people come to me then during a training and say, well, but if I have this fix in there, then it's fixed. Why would I have to check afterwards? Well, there are many different kinds of PDF documents. That's one thing that needs to be said. And you could find a PDF document where the fix that pdfToolbox has doesn't work. Maybe because the PDF is corrupt. And in that case, you want to know about that. So even if you have fixes, you always need to have a check to make sure at the end. There are even fixes where conceptually it's obvious to understand that they will not always work. Yeah, let's take font embedding as an example. I get a PDF file and not all of the fonts are embedded. I use a fix-up that says embed fonts. That fix-up looks at the fonts in the document that are not embedded, tries to find them on my system, and then embeds my system font into my document. Well, if I don't have that particular font in my system, the fix will not be able to embed that font into my document. It's a fairly obvious thing. So I still need a check to make sure that all fonts are embedded afterwards. Okay? So that is why in all of the default profiles, you will find a check and a fix at all times. The check is always there to verify that the fix did its job properly. Okay, so when we look at checks and fixes, the fixes are always run first. The checks are run afterwards to make sure that we find everything, even though we have fixes in there to fix any conceivable problem we might see. We do need the check at the end to make sure of that. And that's basically what you have in profiles. And I have some smaller items once we get back to the presentation. But this is basically what you have in the profile. You have checks and fixes. The fixes are run first, the checks afterwards. For the fixes, you cannot predict the order. For the checks, you don't have to predict the order because it's not relevant. The result will be the same anyway. Let's get back to this fixing issue, because I told you about the limitation, and of course there has to be a way to do this properly in pdfToolbox. What I said is, and actually let me rephrase it, as soon as you make a profile and you start thinking, hold on, is pdfToolbox going to run these fixes in the right order for what I want? Then you're doing the wrong thing. As soon as you start wondering whether the execution order will be correct, don't make a profile. Instead, make a process plan. And a process plan is very similar to a profile for most of pdfToolbox. It can be run using the server the same way as a profile. It can be run using the CLI the same way as a profile. But when I create one or I edit one, it looks very different. And this is a process plan. It's nice and empty at the moment. And you can see that instead of adding to a list of checks and fixes, I have these sequence steps. And with these sequence steps, I build my workflow, if you want. So now I can take a fix-up, and then that appears in my list. And I can add a second fix-up, and we'll choose something else. So now I'm converting color, and I'm also doing something with crop and bleed marks. Now, when we were looking at the profile, I said these little arrows are missing to move stuff up and down. Here in a process plan, I do have these little arrows. So I can say that I first want to convert everything to the color space that I want, and then I want to add crop and bleed marks. And this could actually be relevant already. Even in this very simple example, there could be good reasons to have this color conversion first and the crop and bleed mark adding afterwards. I don't, for example, want these crop and bleed marks to be color converted using my color convert fixup. I want to add them in a very specific color space. So doing the color conversion of all of the page objects first and then adding crop and bleed marks is actually a pretty good idea. But you see what is going on here. Instead of having just a list where, and when I add something else, I can again do this. Instead of just having a list where I have no control over how things happen, I now have a sequenced list where I can decide what fix-up is number one, what is going to be done afterwards, and what is going to be done last. So now I do have full control. Of course, there are many other things why using a process plan might make sense, but this was one of the reasons why process plans were invented in the first place, to control the order of things. And of course, I now also have a way to deal with what happens. If I run this color conversion and there is a failure, I could say, well, if this action fails, then there is really no point in running any of the other fix-ups. And so I can say exit sequence, and pdfToolbox will simply stop processing this, this process plan. Or I could say, well, if this action fails, then I want to skip the second fix-up, and I want to continue with the third. And that too is possible. So process plans, of course, are not just about the order of fix-ups. They are also about conditional processing, looking at the result of a particular sequence step, and then deciding how you want to proceed based on that result. And of course, they not only cater for fix-ups, they also cater to checks, for example. And again, here the order can be set. So where in a profile it's always fixes first and checks afterwards, here I can put a check at the very top, and I could say, well, are there any bitmap images? If there are any bitmap images, I want to do something with them. If there are no bitmap images, then I want to continue with step 4, or I want to get out of this process plan altogether. So you can make a mix of different steps, and those steps can be running a check and then acting on the result. They can be running a fix-up and acting on the result. I can run a complete profile and act on the result. I can run an action, and an action is something that you create inside of the switchboard. I don't know if I have good examples in this particular, yes, so here is an action that would save PNG images from the current file. And I can have a step that is a variable, and that allows me to work with scripts within this process plan. And that step, I can then do JavaScript calculations, for example, or show something to the user to ask them for input that will then decide how the flow continues, and so on and so on. Yeah. But to stick to our topic, the main thing to remember about process plans is that they allow you to set the order of fix-ups. That's how we got here. So let's return to this presentation for just a second, and then I think I'm almost done. So if you have any questions, now would be a good time to enter them. There are a few, maybe not exceptions, but maybe exceptions to what I'm saying. You will not encounter them very much, but you might see their result. The first thing is what I call a check for visual differences. And it's pretty likely that you've never used this before because it's not that well known, unfortunately. But let me see if I can find this. Yes. So there is a possibility to build a preflight check that will compare the original file before you run the profile with the result file after you run the profile. And so how you have to imagine this is you have a PDF document and you have a profile. And the profile does all kinds of naughty things to this PDF document, like maybe embedding fonts. And what you want to make sure of is that the fix-up that embeds fonts does not break anything. So that the visual, the way this file looks visually after my profile is still the same as the way it looked visually before my profile. Well, that's why you can make a check like this. When you run this check, I said that fix-ups are always ran first. Well, they are, but when you have this particular check in a preflight profile, then pdfToolbox will create a snapshot of the document first. Then it will run all fix-ups and checks, and then it will look at the snapshot of the resulting document, compare it to the original document, and if there are visual differences according to these parameters, it will give you a preflight error. So the check is still run at the end of the preflight profile together with the other checks, but pdfToolbox does do some action at the very beginning of the preflight profile. So you could look at this as a little bit of an exception. It's worth mentioning, and this check can be nice, so this was a good excuse to bring up that particular check as well. The second thing is that you have this check and fix for standard compliancy. And if you look closely to what pdfToolbox is doing sometimes, you will already see that something a little bit out of the ordinary is going on with that as well. What is this? Well, if we look at profiles, and I can actually use the same one. When we look at profiles, there is this, like I said, standards compliancy section, and there is a convert to standard section. And what will happen when you switch this on? So what happens in this profile is that pdfToolbox needs to, as part of the fixing that it does, needs to put pdfX4 metadata into the file. Part of the pdfX4 standard says that a file will have identifying metadata in the file. So there need to be some tags in the metadata to identify it as a pdfX4 document. Yeah? And that metadata is, you can actually see that. So if I would look at my my demo files here, I believe that this file, let's have a look. Yes, so this file contains that metadata. More specifically, this particular file claims to be a pdfX3 file. Yeah? Now think about what happens when you ask pdfToolbox to run such a profile and convert a file into pdfX. Well, it has to add that metadata. So the fix for convert to pdfX will add the metadata to the document. However, when all the fixes have been done, pdfToolbox also runs all of the checks, and part of those checks will be, you guessed it, in this other section, this verify compliance section. So one of the checks that will be run is a check whether the document is now compliant to pdfX4. And it could well be that it is not. Maybe we have not done color conversion and the document contains device RGB. Device RGB is not allowed in any pdfX file. So pdfToolbox now, during the fixing, added the metadata for pdfX compliancy to this document, but then during the checking process, finds out that the document is not compliant after all. And so after all of the checking, it is possible that pdfToolbox will then have a little fix that runs again and that removes that metadata from the document again. Yeah? And you can actually see that if I would run this document, this profile on my document, you will see a little pdfX4 badge appear while pdfToolbox is doing the fixing. And if the file ends up not being compliant, you will then see that badge disappear again at the very end of processing. So again, you can consider this a little bit of an exception because there is a fix or part of a fix that runs at the end of the profile, while I told you in the beginning that all fixes happen at the front of a profile. So a little bit of an exception, but it's part of the standard compliancy, and there is really no other good way to do this. And then the last point is, I told you that we begin with checks and then we do, we begin with fixes and then we do all the checks in the profile. That's the order. Well, there is one step that we skip when I say that, and that's, so fixes first, checks afterwards, but this profile also has the option to have a script. And when I say write a script, I could write some very clever JavaScript. Hello, there, that's valid JavaScript even. I can say okay. And now I have a profile script. Well, actually, the profile script is the first thing to be done when you start running a profile. That is done before any fix-ups and before any checks. Why? Well, because in that profile script, I can do calculations, I can specify variables, and those calculations and those variables could then be used in one of the fixes or in one of the checks. So that has to happen first. Of course, it's not really a fix or a checks by itself. It's a definition of a variable or a definition of a script, but still it's important to realize that there is something that runs before these fixes. And in some profiles, you can actually take very nice advantage of that. And I will give you one example if I find it here. So if I go to digital large formats, this is not a final profile from the Gantour group, but it's a profile that the Gantour group is working on. And when you look here, there are a number of checks. You can see that they are variable because I have this little ellipses, these 3 black dots next to the check category, and I have a number of fix-ups in here. And when you look at this profile, this actually contains a script that does real work. And in that, I will define 2 variables, so 2 things that will be asked to the user, a scaling factor and a viewing distance, and then various of the other checks in this profile take advantage of these variables that were asked to the user. There is some calculation here, and in these checks, we use the calculated values. So the fact that this happens at the very beginning of the profile means that you can do calculations and so on, and you can have some logic at the beginning of the profile that is then used by these checks. And if I show you an example of a check that uses it, then you'll see that instead of having a simple value in here, this uses a variable, and that variable was calculated in that initialization script. So our fix-ups, the first thing to be executed in a profile, yes, in a way, but of course, those init scripts are always run before all of the checks and fix-ups. So if you want, that is another exception. Okay, that is all as far as I am concerned. I think it must have been really, really clear because I can see not a single question in here, not that I'm complaining. But let me recap very quickly what we talked about. We talked about downloading old versions of the software. So as we said there, very, very simple. Make sure that you have an account on either the 4Ps website or on the Callas software website. And with that account, you can then download the current versions without having to fill out that form every time. And you can also download supported older versions. And then the rest of this talk was about the order specifically in a pre-flight profile inside of the list of checks that is run, inside of the list of fixes that is run, and in between checks and fixes. And if you remember one thing from that part of the presentation, let it be that if you ever question what the order is going to be that pdfToolbox will use for fixes, please remember that you should not use a profile for that. Switch to a process plan and implement it in there. And of course, you can mix the two. You can make a profile that contains most of the checks and fixes that you need, and then add that profile to a process plan, and maybe add 2 more fix-ups to that process plan of which you want to create, you want to control the order in precisely, and that will work without a problem. But in a profile, you cannot control what order pdfToolbox is going to use.